So we have 3 items for discussion on our work session this evening. I'm trying to get to that page here. We have our nuisance ordinance discussion, and then the boulevard and right-of-way tree policy, and then a storm damage and tree debris policy. So we're going to start out with our nuisance ordinance. As you saw in the packet, I talked with Ron earlier about this. The first, I don't know how many pages were from Andrew Biggerstaff that we saw about more than a year ago. And so I won't go over that unless you have specific questions regarding that. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Ron, and we can talk about the ordinance or maybe what direction we want to go from here. Council, do you have any questions regarding the memo dated, I think it was January 11th back in 2018 from Andrew Biggerstaff?
This is John.
Hi, this is
Okay, Shannon, go first. Go ahead, Shannon.
Yes, and not specifically about the memo, but I think before we even begin, it would be good for the council to understand, and I asked Mr. Brony this morning to be prepared to answer this, is how many properties have been the subject of complaints about, nuisance properties? I think that's something that we all need to understand before we even begin to talk about this. If that's something that Chief Falls can address, or we can get an idea of that and the nature of the complaints and the resolution of them, to get an idea of how big this problem is before we dive into solving it.
Okay, Chief, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, Mayor and Council, I'd be happy to answer that. So I think that is a good place to start. So what I had my staff do is run, I guess, a call history for the last 5 years, so 2015 through 2019, specifically for nuisance violations in Minnetrista. So with that, it varies between, it's very few complaints actually, 21 violations in 2015. We had, and then it goes down as low as 12 in 2017, and then I think last year we had 15 complaints or violations. And so it's a relatively low number, and of those, I don't have a specific number, but of those relatively few complaints, the vast majority of those get resolved without having to issue a citation. We just simply talk to the property owner about whatever the complaint or issue is, and then work with them, give them some time and direction on how to become compliant, if you will, and then they do that. Every so often we get someone who just doesn't follow through completely, and we end up issuing a citation, but that is generally for something very specific, like junk or unregistered vehicles on the property, things like that. And again, that's fairly rare. Most people bring those things into compliance with just a warning.
Okay, and Mr. Chamberlain, you had a question or wanted to make a comment?
I had a question on the Mr. Biggerstaff's stuff from 18. I wasn't on the council at that time. Just a clarification on 2 terms. Public nuisance makes the statement of if there's a considerable number of people that raise the issue. And then on the private, it talks about a small, isolated class of people. Is there, is there a definition of what is a considerable amount of people? I mean, if it's on a kind of a dead end road or something, and it's only the neighbors out of a city of 7,000, is that considerable, or how do you get your arms around that?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yes.
Whoever's got a good answer.
Well, I'll try. I don't think there is a good answer in the sense that there is no definitive dividing line in terms of number. I think it's a judgment call. And so you do have to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. The city gets a lot of calls from neighbors complaining about one another. And one of the first things that staff always has to evaluate is this really a dispute between a couple of neighbors, or does it involve the greater public? And because the neighbors are always trying to drag the city into some sort of dispute. So I think that's a fair question, but I don't think it's one that can be answered definitively.
So maybe I'll just weigh in here with a few comments, John, since you weren't part of that discussion. So we had the discussion with Andrew Biggerstaff, and we talked about all the different options as he presented in his memo. At that time, the council felt it would have been far too costly to pursue any of those options, and or with the outcome being somewhat ambiguous. We didn't know if it would actually result in a positive outcome. So at that time we said, well, we really don't have the financial wherewithal to pursue any of these properties that fall into this nuisance category, or we're going to call them junk properties. That's the big driving force behind this, is properties that have excessive junk on them. That's why we're having this conversation again. And to Chief Paul's comment is, I do know several people have complained to me personally about several different properties in our city, but when I've said and asked them to call the police and lodge a formal complaint, they've been unwilling to do that because they feel like, well, then it's like I'm going to be reporting my neighbor and I'm not going to do that. So there may be more complaints or more people that don't like these properties that we're not hearing from. The other thing is, a lot of people have complained multiple times already and not a lot has been accomplished, or they keep falling back into non-compliance and keep repeating, and then you go out and you talk to them again, and then they quickly come into compliance, and it's just kind of a vicious circle or cycle. And so maybe a lot of people have just kind of given up on reporting or complaining. So with that, are there any other questions though for Chief Falls or for in regards to the memo put together a few years ago by Mr. Biggerstaff?
Go ahead.
This is Pam. I have a couple question and then a comment. And I guess this goes to Paul Falls. In the 2019 complaints, you said there was like 15. Was that all the complaints, the 15, was that for different properties, or was it just for like a couple properties?
Mayor and Council, that's a good question. And so this doesn't sort it out by property address. So I can tell you, just with knowledge of 2019 still fresh in my head, this would include, it could be very well be multiple complaints about a couple of properties, and I know that to be the case. So if, for example, if someone complained 3 or 4 different times, resulting in, it would have to result in a separate case number. So if we had an active case open, we would just make it part of that case. If a case was resolved and someone called again, then we would create a new case, and that would count as yet another number. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And my comment on this is, there's one particular property that I think we're all pretty well aware of, and the discussion of this nuisance property and this whole discussion tonight, I would like to see if we could move it to a different time once we get back into regular sessions, because I think there would be a number of residents that live in this area that would like to hear the conversation. And, you know, with us having it just on the phone, it makes it very difficult. So is this a possibility that we could even maybe just talk briefly about it tonight, but then continue the conversation when we get back to more normal circumstances with our meetings?
So Pam, this is Mayor Whalen. Actually tonight, we're really not going to be making any decisions. I think what we're looking for, or what my idea is to give staff direction as to what we would like to do. So let's just say we'd like to tweak our nuisance ordinance or maybe rewrite it or something to that effect. Then we can give staff some ideas, what we're thinking, maybe some changes that we can make, and then they would, or give them different, or maybe just say, yeah, we want to see how many tools we could put in our toolbox. What are they? Bring back those ideas. So this is just one of maybe 2 or 3 conversations that we'll be having. We're not going to make any firm decisions this evening, though.
Okay. Can we hold off on future decision or conversations until we get back into session? I mean, I hope it doesn't have to last long, that we have to do phone meetings, but you know, maybe make it for whenever it first opens up, where more of the residents are able to join in and hear.
Well, first of all, both for the work session as well as for the regular meeting, you are allowed to, or the residents can call in and be listening. So that's if they want to hear what's being said. And the other thing is, but we can discuss that. Why don't we go through this evening first and see where we end up, with what the council wants to do, and then decide when the next meeting would be that we would talk about this.
That sounds good.
Okay, and Shannon, you said you had a comment?
Yes, I really didn't get an answer to how many properties have been the subject of nuisance property complaints. I was looking for a number, and I never heard a number.
Chief
Mayor and Council, I did give some numbers about the number of complaints we've received. Well, I guess the question is, if you're asking how many properties, physical properties,
yes,
does that include? I don't have that number. It's possible I could get it. It depends on how we track it. I just have the number of complaints. I can tell you from 2019, however, just because that is fairly fresh, that of the 15 complaints that we received, several of those are related to 2 properties. So it's a relatively low number of actual properties. I know that's not a definitive number, but I can think of off the top of my head of 2 properties in Minnetrista that resulted in several complaints each in 2019. And they both happen to be in ag preserve properties, which I think is the bigger issue that we're having than properties that are not in the ag preserve areas.
So would it be fair to say that your estimate is there are 2 properties that have been the target of most of these complaints?
I would say that's fairly accurate, yes. We do get some others, but they're relatively minor in scope compared to these 2 properties that I'm referring to.
Okay, thank you.
And Chief, I think we used to have another property similar to the 2 that you're referring to out on the island, and I think that has that gone away?
Madam Mayor and Council, yes, that property has been sold, so there's now a new owner there, and that was not an ag preserve property, but it was definitely over the years a source of a number of complaints, and that was an example of one of those properties that we had to work with on a fairly routine basis, maybe once a year, once every other year, where they would just accumulate more stuff, and so then we'd get a complaint and have to go out, and they ultimately ended up fencing it in, but that has sold, and the new owners cleaned it up.
Okay, and I know also in past years there's been other properties that have had similar situations. My recollection is there was one on Deer Creek Road East on the other side of 15. That was quite on Whaletail Lake, I believe.
Yes, and I believe that has been sold maybe a couple times over now since that issue. That is correct, and so I think those are good examples of cases where we have been able to work with property owners and get matters resolved. It's just it's a little bit more difficult in the ag preserve areas. I don't know if you want me to comment, but this might be a good time to I guess, kind of describe a little bit of the frustration from the public safety side, because I think there is an expectation from some of the public that we be able to go out and make this thing look pristine, and that's not always the case. So I think there's a bit of frustration on both sides relevant to that issue.
Okay, yeah. So I guess, again, what I would like to see us do is take a look at our current ordinance, our nuisance ordinance, and I think with some minor tweaks, we could actually make a significant difference. Some of the things I talked to Ron about were, for instance, could we, in our ordinance, specifically state that fire trucks, old used fire trucks, old used ambulances are not allowed to be stored on people's properties? I mean, why would they need to have them there? If they have them there for some other reason, let's say a business reason, then they need to come to the city and get a CUP. So that might be one way of addressing some of this, because that's been one of the issues on the Deer Creek Road property. Not just fire trucks and old ambulances, but numerous old boats and RVs and things like that. The other question I would have for Ron is, could we limit the amount of vehicles that people could have on their property that would be within sight of neighboring properties? So Ron, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, since we don't have a lot of time, I think that's what I'd be interested in hearing is, what kinds of problems do you want to address, either specific properties or in general? The reason I say that is because there are a number of tools that could potentially be available. I think the point of the memo that Andrew put together a couple of years ago was to demonstrate the breadth of the tools potentially available. Those include criminal prosecution, hazardous building statutes, zoning approaches, as well as ordinary nuisance approaches. And which one you would use would depend on the circumstances of the case. And so, I'm hearing, not surprisingly, a couple of situations that I'm aware of. If there are others out there that people are concerned about, again, either specific properties or in general, I think it would be good to talk about those. What I'd like to do then is be able to evaluate what tools we already have in the toolbox. You already do have a zoning ordinance and a nuisance ordinance, although the nuisance ordinance is a little bit old. See what tools we already have available, and then come back to you and suggest how those might be updated, or what new tools, new ordinances we might want to adopt.
Okay. All right. I'll start with Mike Molitor. Any comments or suggestions?
Just a couple of comments. Mayor, you made some comments about, first of all, in the time that I've been on the council, I don't think I've received any complaints. If I have it, maybe just the one on Deer Creek, but that's the only one I'm aware of. And Mayor, you made some comments about people not making a formal complaint. I guess my thought on that is, sorry to take a tough line, but if you can't make a formal complaint to the city because you're afraid to do so, I really don't see why the city should then get involved with that. It just, to me, it's like, it has to start with the homeowner, the neighboring property. You have to make a complaint, and a formal complaint. Otherwise, it's just not going to be worth our effort. And so that's my one concern. In terms of trying to write something for this specific property, I know that's going to be a challenge. And conceptually speaking, I don't see anything that's changed since we revisited the subject in 2018. And I'm not so sure, I don't know the legality of trying to write out things like fire trucks and ambulances. You know, I'm not sure if you can do that. You're legally allowed to own those. I don't know if you can write something for that. So I think this is going to be a real tough needle to thread, and I'm not so sure that in the end, you know, I don't know if we're going to give it, if we get another tool, are we going to be able to effectively cut the board with that tool? And so I'm kind of hesitant. I'm not hearing anything that says we really need to make an action here. So, thanks.
Oh, okay. The only comment, and then I'll go down the line here. The only comment I would make is I'm looking at this from not just the current properties, but I think we also have to ask ourselves, do we want these types of properties to be popping up elsewhere and in more frequency in our city? I guess that would be the question as well. And so, yeah, maybe we only have 2 or 3, maybe 4 right now that would fall under the extreme junk situation. But what about down the road? And a good example of that is the Red Barn property. It was not a junk property up until a couple of years ago. And now it's kind of popped up and become junky. And so do we want to just say, okay, fine, let's not do anything because we only have a few in our city? Or do we want to be a little proactive and say, look, this is what our city stands for. This is what we'd like our city to look like, and put some kind of parameters around it. Those would be a few questions that I would have at the council. So, Mr. Chamberlain, you want to weigh in a little bit?
Could I address that one concern before we move on?
Sure. Go ahead, Mike.
What you see, you know, and I know the Enchanted property. I used to walk by it every day, and you see this all the time, especially in cities in Minnetrista, where we're very fortunate to have rising property values. And the chief noted this as well, is generally people move out, someone else comes in, paid a much higher value for the property and cleans it up. And I think, you know, that the turnover kind of takes care of a lot of that problem it did on Enchanted, and you see it quite a bit. So in terms of future action, some of this will take care of itself as people move on. And it just becomes, quite frankly, too expensive to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a piece of property and accumulate junk that's little to no value. And it's kind of a good thing that we're in that spot. And if it does become an issue in the future, there's always a future council that could act on their discretion. But that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chamberlain?
If we can add some specifics to the ordinance that are legally acceptable, I would not have a problem with that. If we're going to put in there additional verbiage that kind of is based on the existing one we have today, I don't have a problem with that, again, as long as it is legally acceptable. I think, as Chief Fall says, we have to look at, or Mr. Beatty said, we need to look at each of these individually, and obviously the ordinance is what we're basing our view on, and it has to be objective versus subjective. And I agree with Mr. Molitor again, if there is complaints being filed or people want to file a complaint, if they don't want to step up and be accounted for, then I don't see that it's the city's responsibility. Excuse me if I drop off my voice here. I don't see that it's the city's responsibility to pursue them unless, obviously, we've got the backing of the populace. And that's where it got back to the question of what is a considerable group of people, etc.
Okay. Ms. Bruce, Shannon, what do you want to add to it?
Yes, thank you. I concur with Mr. Molitor on pretty much everything that he stated. And I just want to talk a little bit about the subjective nature of junk. And there's a property not too far from where I live where it's just off 26 and Game Farm, and there's a 1930 shell of an old pickup truck, and they put flowers in it. It's at the entrance to their driveway, and they put flowers in the summertime, and they decorate it for Halloween and Christmas, and everybody thinks it's wonderful. And it's very subjective. And when you get to the point where you're saying, well, you can't allow old used trucks or fire trucks or ambulances, and defining those things, I think that's someplace I'm not comfortable going. I'm also not comfortable limiting the number of vehicles that someone can have on their properties, because you can have property that has trees on it and nobody's going to see the number of vehicles. And I tend to lean on the freedom side of things. And as I read the current ordinance where it talks about public nuisance is defined, where it says maintaining a condition that annoys a considerable number of persons, I think that definition is fine. And I think Mr. Chamberlain's question about a considerable number of persons, I think obviously that's more than one. And I don't have a problem having a process that the city implements to make sure that these complaints are not just frivolous, personal disputes between neighbors. And if we had a process that said, okay, if you're going to complain about a property and you want the city to take action on it, if you get 3 neighbors to concur and join with you in that complaint, that's proof that it's affecting a considerable number of persons. And that might be a way that we can take care of a property that truly is affecting a number of people. What I want to stay away from is our personal disputes and getting involved in frivolous complaints that just burden the city. And I'm not sure we need anything in addition to what I've seen in our current ordinance. I think it's, from what I've read, it seems capable of dealing with the complaint that we're really here to talk about tonight. And maybe Mr. Beatty can talk about how the city would pursue this property using the current ordinance as it stands, and what are the problems if we just use our current ordinance.
So I'm going to make a couple comments. So I agree. I don't think we want to get into a neighbor versus neighbor dispute. And also, we don't, my comment earlier was limiting the number of vehicles that your neighbor can see. So in other words, if you have a large garage or you have a lot of trees, nobody can see them. I don't think that we need to be that critical to say, yes, you can't have that many. But, and then also Mr. Chamberlain and maybe Mr. Molitor made the comment about, well, if we've only had a couple complaints, but we've had a lot of complaints regarding one particular property, and it's been more than just one person. And if you went around that neighborhood, you would probably get 7 or 8 or 9 complaints about the property. So my question is, at what point then do we say, so if that's the nexus to say, okay, now the city will get involved, then the question is, we've gotten involved and the property is still pretty much looks the same as it did before. And that's why I'm saying I think we need to look at the nuisance ordinance to see if it truly holds up, and if we can get some of these properties, I'm not saying to look pristine, not by any means, but to get them to look a little bit better. And like you said, Shannon, not put the person that has an old truck in front of their driveway entrance and plants it with flowers. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at multiple, 15, 20 vehicles that are junky vehicles. That's what we're looking at least on the properties that we're talking about. But Mr. Beatty, maybe you could weigh in and answer Shannon's question about, is our current ordinance sufficient to address these properties?
You know, when Mayor and Council, when this came up once before Andrew's 2018 memo and discussion, it came out perhaps 2 years before that. I don't remember the context, but I took a look at the city's ordinance, which you've now seen. My evaluation of it was that it was dated. For example, there's a reference to village in there that gives you some indication of when at least some part of it was written. I thought it contained some, but probably not all the things that you might want to list as nuisances. I also thought it was particularly deficient in terms of process. And at the time, I had just recently redrafted the Medina ordinance, which also was outdated, and provided that as a template for at least a place to start, both from a substantive and procedural standpoint. So I do think reviewing and probably revising the city's nuisance ordinance is something that you ought to do. Whether you want to go beyond that is sort of a policy question that you would want to address. And if we do that, there are different ways to approach it. One of them is through the zoning ordinance, which involves business use of property or in places where it shouldn't be. But then there are other approaches that do not involve the zoning ordinance. And I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind, because the nonconformity issue will come up in a zoning context in a way that I don't think it has the same resonance in a non-zoning context. So it's a long way of saying, again, I think we need to sharpen at least the nuisance ordinance tool and maybe look at some others.
So Ron,
So
when you
this
say
is-
other, what other tools would you be looking at, for instance?
Well, it kind of goes back to the comment I made before. What's the problem? Mound recently adopted some ordinances, one of which was an ordinance that prohibited parking trailers in the street overnight. I've seen similar ordinances in a number of cities. I don't know anything about the background, but what that suggests to me is that they must be having a problem with that. And if you're having a problem with it, that's probably a good approach to take. They did not put that in their zoning ordinance. Well, if that's not a problem in Minnetrista, we wouldn't adopt something like that. But that's kind of the discussion that I was trying to encourage. What are the problems? Because then we can figure out what kind of approach we might want to take.
Okay.
This is Shannon, and I have a question for Mr. Beatty. In our current ordinance, it says that a public nuisance is defined as something that annoys a considerable number of persons, maintaining a condition that annoys a considerable number of persons, which this property clearly does. I'm trying to understand why the city can't abate that based on our current ordinance, when it's clear that it's annoying a considerable number of persons, and there's something here in our ordinance that talks about abatement by the city. Can you explain what the problem is with abatement using our current ordinance?
Well,
on this particular property?
Yeah, there still has to be a specific nuisance that is talked about on the property. It can't simply be something the neighbors get together and decide arbitrarily that it annoys them. It has to be some objective problem. My recollection, and this is now a couple of years ago, so I don't remember the details, is that the city's approach to the property on Deer Creek was based on a zoning approach. That is, that he was running a business out of that property, and we did make some progress on that. And ultimately, for reasons that I can't recall, that approach fell apart. It may well be, if the council wants, we should be taking another look and to see whether there is another approach on that property.
Okay.
Can I weigh in on this?
Pam, you
this
haven't
is
weighed in
Pam.
yet. Yeah.
What's that?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Pam.
Okay. First of all, the property on Deer Creek, one of the problems is they haven't, the city has not been able to prove that it is a business. And if you look at what is being housed on that property right now, ambulances, fire trucks, old RVs, I can't believe all of those things that are on that property right now are for personal use. So the property owner right now, in my opinion, is abusing our current ordinance and getting around being able to store that kind of stuff because we are unable to prove that it is a business. And I think that's, one of the biggest problems. And if you look on the ordinance, it does say declaration of other ordinances is following of public nuisances under letter C, the piling, keeping, depositing, accumulation of, or unhoused storage of old, unlicensed, wrecked, or junk vehicles or machinery, or of junk, waste, or other debris. That is exactly what is on that property, and it is obvious he is going, he's doing against our ordinance. So I think, and we have tried many ways to get this changed, and he is fighting the system on it. So I don't know what the best way to go about doing this. I do think this whole ordinance needs to be sharpened up a little bit. Shielding would help the situation to a degree. But I do agree with Ron, it needs to be sharpened. Also, I think we need to look at this property in particular because it is a problem.
Has this property ever been given a notice to abate?
No, we would
I
have
can
to do that.
No, I can chime in here, Mayor and Council. David here
Okay.
talking. We did send enforcement letters. So back to what Ron is saying is we did pursue this property from a zoning ordinance standpoint with the fact that, as we all assume, he's running a business, which isn't in violation of our zoning ordinance. And we sent several letters to the property owner telling them that they could not do that. They were in violation of the zoning ordinance. And their response was, I'm running, this is all, I'm not running a business. This is all for my personal use. And that was it. Refused to comply with any of our zoning ordinance regulations. So they have been put on notice for that, but we have not, as Ron mentioned, we have not pursued the ordinance that you guys are all talking about that's in your packet. That's not the zoning ordinance, that's the nuisance ordinance. So that's the difference.
Right, right.
So the declaration of other ordinances and that sub C that Ms. Mortensen mentioned, that seems like that would be sufficient to give a notice to abate based on C.
Madam Mayor, members of council, if I could comment as well, because there's been several stages to this. And the first would be the one that David just mentioned. There have been a number of nuisance violations that we have found there. The police department, when I say we, have found over the course of all these complaints, many of which have obviously been resolved. I believe, and I'm not positive, but I believe the property owner was even cited 1 or 2 times for some of the specific violations. So there's been a number of things. I also want to comment on junk vehicles is, the definition of that is essentially inoperable or unregistered. So clearly if there's a half a vehicle there, that could be considered junk. However, a lot of times people or the public get frustrated with the police department because we'll go to a property where there's some old vehicles, but if they are operable and they are registered, then regardless of what they look like, they're not considered junk because they're operable and they're registered. And so that's been one of the frustrations.
Yeah. Chief, the other thing is, even if it's an old vehicle and let's call it a junk vehicle, as long as they
Mhm.
have a license on it that's to date, you don't even have the ability to check and make sure that it's actually roadworthy. I mean, does it start? Maybe it starts, but is it going to run any length of time? I mean, we don't even have the ability to do that, do we?
Well, that's a good question, and we do to some extent. I think some of the issues we run into, especially with large properties like this, are that we can't just go up to a large multi-acre property and wander around and look for violations. Certainly, if it's up by the road and we can see it very easily, that's one thing. If we're going to start searching through properties for violations, we would need a search warrant to be able to do that, and we have done that in many cases. So it does get a bit more complex than you probably want to go into right now. But so this property has quite a history, as you know, but the property owner has been, we have, as a police department, dealt with a number of violations, many of which he has corrected. But unfortunately, he just moves it out and then moves something else in there.
Right. And the violations are simply that he has to go and get the vehicle registered and get current tabs on it. I mean, that's basically all they have to do, regardless of what condition it's in. And that's I think, part of the problem of the nuisance ordinance.
Well,
Right, and that's part of the frustration I was talking about on our part, is if we can find some tools that just really allow us to be able to have a little bit more teeth for the enforcement piece, that would be great. And I don't know, we've talked a lot in the past about if you change the ordinance, would that apply to this property? I don't know. That would be a question, I guess, for Ron.
Well, and following up on what Paul just said, I mean, there are junk vehicles, there are abandoned vehicles, and there are unauthorized vehicles. Those all have statutory definitions. So the city has to, and the police have to live with those statutory definitions. Going back to again, on this property, the business aspects of it, we were able to find a number of sales of vehicles from that property, but not enough, which he said were things that he was just doing in the normal course of business, or in the normal course of his personal collection of things. I can sell a vehicle from my property. You can sell a vehicle from your property. So the fact that there's been some sales doesn't mean that he's running a business. Our evaluation of it was that there were not enough sales for us to have a convincing case that it was actually a business. As Paul said, there were actually a number of things going on there that were declared nuisances and have been addressed. So to some extent, the issue has been addressed. One of the other problems, somebody mentioned this early on, is ag property. The statutes and the Constitution give lots of deference to agriculture property, and I can't remember all the details, but there was a lot of discussion about, this is farm country, and I'm a farmer, and I use a lot of these things, and I guess people can evaluate how much they think that was accurate, but that does throw a cloak of protection, at least arguably, over the situation. I'm not saying all that as any kind of excuse, but I think it goes to the complexity sometimes of dealing with these cases.
All right. Any other comments?
I have one question. This is Molitor.
Mr. Molitor, go ahead.
Is there, I don't think we have it now, but I'm just more of a question for Ron. Is there ability to add an escalation here where the first violation gets you X and the second violation gets you Y, and it progressively gets stronger? Since we have multiple citations on one property, is that an option?
Council and Mayor, yes, I think there can be something like that imposed.
Okay, but you'd be capped out at the misdemeanor level of $1,000 infraction, correct?
Well, yes, but the other thing to keep in mind, and we've talked about this in the past, although not this evening, one of the options is between criminal and civil. And in many cases, criminal is easier and quicker. But one of the downsides is that you often don't get the results that you want, particularly in Hennepin County. The judges have a lot more important things to do, in their opinion, and therefore they often don't like cases like this. And what you often get is a $300 or $250 fine, and that's it. We don't want the fine. We want the problem solved, and so that's why you go into a civil action where you're more likely to get the remedy that you want, but it's more expensive. And that comes back to what we've talked about before. To what degree is the council willing to commit time and money to address a particular problem?
Okay. Shannon, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. I'm thinking about a number of properties that I drive by all the time that I can see that they have, and out in the rural areas of Minnetrista, you can see 10-acre properties that have multiple vehicles that you can see from the road, but perhaps they're not close to the road. And I think one of the things that makes this particular property problematic is that everything is very visible and it's close to the road. And I think we need to be careful. We need to be very careful about unintended consequences, about saying you can only have a certain number of vehicles that are visible, because there are some properties that are set back, and you could have the same number of vehicles as this property, and nobody's going to complain about it. So I think that's a very subjective place to go when you talk about number of vehicles or prohibiting types of vehicles or farm implements or things like that, because as Mr. Beatty said, I think there's a constitutional issue here that people that live on ag properties, they have a right to have the things that they need on their properties. And I'm not saying that I've driven by this property on Deer Creek, and I think it's an eyesore. And if I lived near it, I wouldn't like it, and I would want something done about it. And I'd like to find a way that we can get something done about it using our current ordinance. And have we ever said you have to remove X, Y, and Z, or we're going to do it for you?
We can't. With our current ordinance, we can't.
But does the abatement
yeah, but then the city has to pay
section
for that.
says you can.
Yeah. Well,
but then they can reimburse the city. I think I read in Mr. Biggerstaff's stuff that the city could get attorney's fees paid for by the violator. Isn't that true, Mr. Beatty?
That may be possible. I think that there may be circumstances under which a court would order that, but that's not a guarantee. And so you have to go into it being willing to spend the money and feel like, and not expect reimbursement necessarily, and feel like it's worth it because it's cost of doing business.
So again, Shannon, you said a couple things. You said some of these properties, they may have more vehicles, but you can't see them. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. If you can't see them, it's not. No, I said you can.
I said you can see them. I said you can see them. They're just set back further from the road, is what I said.
And I don't know that all of them. Well, yeah. And when I drive around and I look at properties, first of all, Ron had also alluded to the fact that it's ag. So there are certain exemptions if you're a farmer. You can't say that they can't have combines or can't have whatever tractors and all of that stuff. They're kind of excluded from a lot of they would be excluded, put it that way. My understanding of the benefits of being a farmer. But the other properties, if they have 10 vehicles that are back from the road and they're not bothering anybody, that's one issue. But when you have 20 vehicles that are scattered all over, and your neighbors can see them, that's, I think, what we're trying to address. We're not trying to address that one 1940s pickup truck in somebody's driveway. We're not trying to address the 5 or 6 or 10 or 7 or 8 cars that are parked away from the road that people don't have a view of. That's not what we're talking about. I think we're talking about the situation that's particularly on Deer Creek Road out there. And I guess like I would say is, again, I'm thinking this is a problem for several properties right now, or several properties are a problem. But who's to say that we're not going to get more? That's the other thing we should be looking at. So we need to wrap this up fairly quickly. So I guess I would say I'm at least in favor of taking a look at our current ordinance and seeing what tweaks we should be making, updating it, whatever. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't want to limit people's rights and liberties. I just want to make sure that all people's rights and liberties are protected as well. Any other, Pam, where are you coming from?
I agree with you on that. It is a fine line when you're telling people what they can and can't put on the properties, but you have to remember that this one particular property just came to be recently. You have all the other residents have been here for many years, and all of a sudden we've got a junkyard that we're looking at, and people can argue it depreciates the property, and I tend to agree with that to a point. But, you know, that is something we have to consider. And I don't want to tell people what they can and they can't put on the property. That is, you know, again, that's walking a very fine line. But I think this one particular has to be addressed. And I think changing the ordinance would help address that situation.
Mike, you want to make a last comment here?
I don't disagree, you know, with the concept of an issue here, but, you know, we're certainly not unique in addressing this issue or trying to address this issue. And it remains an issue for just about every community out there. I'm just not sold on, granted, there's, you know, yeah, when you're calling it the village in the ordinance, that's obviously that's old, but I haven't heard anything that said, if we make this tweak, we now have a tool that will help solve this particular problem. I haven't heard that yet. And I guess until I can hear something that says we can put X, Y, and Z into the ordinance that would specifically address this issue, all I think we're going to have is a revised ordinance, and we're still going to have this issue. So I'm not convinced that we've got a better solution than any other city out there.
And I think that's a valid comment. I think what we're looking for tonight is giving staff some direction and bringing back some ideas, not even a revised ordinance maybe at this point, but giving staff some direction, and then they would come back with some ideas and maybe some options. So this isn't a rewrite tonight of the ordinance. I don't think Ron or staff is looking for that direction tonight. I think, like I said, maybe figuring out, is there anything we can do? If not, then we leave it as is. Mr. Trumperlin?
I would agree with about everything that's been said. Maybe the ordinance can be enhanced, updated, as it seems to be somewhat old. Mr. Beatty was involved with the Medina one. Probably that looks like it has more detail to it. I think if we're going to update it, then the abatement and the penalties related to that, if it's not done, or if it's done and then it goes back to the way it was, escalating the penalties, that should be somewhere in there. And the thing we all have to recognize, which I'm sure we do, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that you're always going to get one of these sooner or later where a friendly discussion with them or letters is not going to get a response. They're going to just take a stance. And so we as a city, we as a council, we have to be willing also then, are we going to push the envelope, incur the court costs, et cetera, to do it? And that's something, of course, we do on a one-by-one basis at that time, as long as the ordinance is strong enough.
Yeah, good point. And Ms. Bruce?
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Molitor. I haven't heard anything that has been proposed. I'm not sure there is anything that can be proposed that's going to solve this problem magically for us. I think I wouldn't be opposed to having the violation amount of progressive, escalation of the violation fine. But I am opposed to identifying numbers of vehicles or starting to identify things that you can and cannot have on your property out in the rural areas of Minnetrista. I'm adamantly opposed to that. And I've thoroughly read the Medina ordinance as well, and I think that goes way beyond anything that I'm comfortable with.
Okay.
Mayor,
So,
may I make one
Yep.
real quick comment? Just in wrapping up here, I think it's important from my perspective. I've had a number of these conversations with chiefs over the last several years about how they deal with this. And I can assure you, most cities are in our exact same position. And the success stories that I have heard about properties very similar to the one we're talking about, those success stories, there's not a lot of them, but the ones that I've heard have come through the abatement process. So for what it's worth, I think however we move forward, whether we change something or not, I think that ultimately to deal with a property like this, that is the process that was used to create what those cities viewed as a success. So I'll just leave it at that.
but in order to do the abatement process, we would have to strengthen, I believe, I could be wrong, but we'd have to probably strengthen our nuisance ordinance. Otherwise, the property owner could say, I'm not in violation of anything.
Right, I
Ron?
recognize that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, as Pam said, we maybe probably need, and we kind of knew this, we'd be bringing it back, but I'd like to at least have staff at least give us some options. I know we talked about the abatement, but if we did abatement, what would that cost? How successful would we be? And then can we do an abatement with our current ordinance, or is it just too easy to come into compliance? Those would I think, be the questions that I would have and that I'd like to see brought back. So I can't see heads nodding or disagreeing. Are there?
I agree with that,
Others?
Lisa. This is
Okay,
Pam. I agree.
Okay, Mr. Molitor.
I don't see, unfortunately, I just don't see a value in it. I'm sorry. No.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chamberlain?
I would agree.
Okay. Agree with what I said, or what?
With your points.
Okay. Ms. Bruce, I know you said you wouldn't want to see numbers, but would you like to see any changes?
I don't think we need to see any changes in the ordinance. I do support abatement using the current ordinance, and I'm not sure we've tried that. So I would certainly support abatement using our current ordinance.
So maybe what we need to do is bring this back with, and then have some discussion about abatement and whether or not it's even possible with our current ordinance. I think that's kind of the consensus that I'm hearing here. So with that, it is 6:37. So I don't think we're going to get to the boulevard and right-of-way tree policy or the storm damage and debris policy tonight. I do want to take a little bit of a break between this meeting and next meeting. Mr. Baroni, can we move this forward to our next work session?
Mayor and Council, we certainly can.
Okay. So with that, you're all agreed that we can move item number 3 and 4 to our, what would be April 20th work session.
I'm fine with that.
Yes,
Agreed.
Okay. Okay.
Yes,
I
I'm fine
agree.
with that.
All right. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make that motion. This is
So-
Pam.
I'll second that.
Okay.
This is Mike.
Okay. Pam made the motion and Mike seconded. All those in favor signify with aye, and I'm going to have to do a roll call. Pam, what is your vote?
Aye.
Mike, what is your vote?
Aye.
John, what is your vote?
Aye.
And Shannon, what is your vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes, so the motion passes to adjourn 5-0. So we will reconvene for our regular meeting at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.